In early medieval Europe, most justice happened close to home. Local courts heard disputes over theft, injury, and land. But they rarely had what modern people expected: witnesses who felt safe, records that could be checked, or trained investigators. So the court leaned on what it could measure. Reputation mattered. Oaths mattered. If enough neighbours swore a person was honest, that could outweigh a suspicion. That system sounded solid until it met a hard case. What happened when the only witness disappeared, or when both sides found friends ready to swear? Oaths became a contest of social power. The well-connected gathered supporters. The disliked stood alone. The court still needed an ending, not an endless argument. And when human proof failed, people reached for another kind of proof, one that claimed to rise above bias. A new shortcut started to look like an answer. If no one could truly know, God could. The idea promised a verdict that no neighbour could fake and no rich patron could buy. It did not ask the court to investigate, it asked the court to submit. This was the turning point. Justice began to tilt from community judgment toward a test that claimed to reveal truth through divine decision. The change came quietly at first, then spread. Ordeal stopped being an emergency trick and became a normal step inside a court case. When proof ran thin, officials no longer asked only neighbours to swear and vouch. They sent the accused toward a test that claimed to force the truth out of the body. It sounded fair, even clean. Let God decide, and the community could stop arguing. That promise depended on the church. Clergy led the ritual that made the ordeal feel official, not random violence. The person accused fasted, prayed, and entered a process wrapped in blessings and rules. The judge did not just order a punishment, he ordered a sacred procedure. A trial turned into a religious event, with the priest guiding each step so the outcome could be treated as a verdict, not an accident. Once that happened, the centre of gravity shifted. Guilt and innocence no longer lived mainly in reputation and compromise. They lived in the moment everyone watched, when a body met fire, water, or iron under holy supervision. The crowd did not see a debate, they saw a sign. And because the ritual looked like God's work, the decision became harder to challenge. The ordeal gave courts certainty, at a brutal price. The ordeal of hot iron began with movement, not pain. The accused was led in a procession, watched by neighbours who would remember every step. At the centre of it all, the iron was treated as more than metal. It was consecrated, placed under clerical control, and tied to prayer and ritual. That mattered, because it framed what came next as judgment, not punishment. Then the test itself happened quickly. The iron was heated, and the accused had to carry it a set distance or lift it and hold it for a counted moment, depending on the local rule. A slip did not just mean clumsiness, it looked like guilt. When it ended, the hand was immediately wrapped. The bandage was not mercy, it was part of the procedure. The verdict did not come that day. The hand stayed sealed for days, sometimes 3, while everyone waited for the body to speak. Only then was the wrapping removed in front of witnesses, and the wound was inspected. Clean healing counted as innocence. Swelling, rot, or a bad burn counted as guilt. Pain became evidence. Recovery became a legal fact. After iron, some courts turned to a harsher test, fire itself. The accused had to walk between lines of flame or carry a burning object for a set distance. The rule sounded simple. If the person endured it or showed only slight injury, the court treated that as a clean verdict. If the skin blistered badly, guilt seemed proven. Pain stopped being a symptom. It became a decision. This ordeal worked because everyone agreed on what the outcome meant before it happened. Fire did not just burn flesh, it was said to expose the truth. Officials measured steps and time. Clergy blessed the ritual and watched the handling of the flames. Then the body got read like a document. A stumble, a flinch, a scorch mark in the wrong place, each detail turned into evidence. The margin between innocence and guilt narrowed to inches. And now a new force entered the process: the crowd. People gathered expecting a sign, and expectation turned into pressure. A dramatic survival looked like proof that heaven had spoken. A dramatic burn looked like justice finally landing. That public hunger mattered because it changed how the ordeal got remembered and reported. The more the trial felt like a spectacle, the more the verdict depended on what onlookers believed they had witnessed, not only what the accused had endured. The water ordeal promised a simple answer when words and witnesses failed. In some courts, the accused faced cold water. They were bound, lowered in, and watched as closely as any confession. In others, the test turned to heat, with boiling water used as the proving ground. Either way, the logic stayed the same. Water became the courtroom, and the body became the proof. Cold immersion worked on a brutal idea of purity. If the person sank, it was taken as acceptance, even mercy, and people called it innocence. If the person floated, it was read as rejection, as if the water itself refused them. That detail mattered more than physics or panic. Floating stopped being an accident. It became a verdict. The crowd watched a body, and they believed they saw a soul. Boiling water carried the same message, just delivered through skin. The accused reached in, pulled an object from the pot, then waited days for the injury to be inspected. A cleaner wound meant a cleaner conscience. A blistered, infected hand meant guilt had surfaced. In both versions, the test forced nature to speak morality. Sinking, floating, healing, burning. Every outcome was turned into judgment. The people pushed toward ordeal rarely sat at the top of the village. It fell on peasants who depended on neighbours, on the landless who lacked kin to speak for them, and on servants whose word carried little weight. When trouble rose, missing grain, a dead animal, a sudden fire, suspicion searched for the easiest target. Ordeal promised a clean answer. In practice, it pointed downward. Women faced a sharper edge. Accusations of theft, adultery, or secret harm clung to them because their roles kept them close to food, cloth, and household medicine. Things that vanished and things that frightened people. Outsiders faced it too. Travellers, newcomers, anyone without a long memory in the community. They lacked reputation, lacked allies, lacked the protection that turned a charge into a warning instead of a trial. And here the ordeal changed. It no longer worked only as a way to decide guilt. It worked as a way to keep order. Powerful families avoided the flames and water through options the poor rarely had. They gathered oath helpers, paid for settlements, or hired champions to fight in their place. The powerless stood alone, and the risk of God's judgment landed where resistance was weakest. The ordeal looked like a simple test, but it ran on strict ritual. Before it happened, fasting and prayer often became requirements, and priests decided who followed them correctly. That control mattered. A weakened body reacted differently to heat, pain, and shock. Even the schedule could shift the odds. When a court picked the day, it also picked the conditions. The verdict started forming before the first step or the first plunge. Priestly oversight did not stop at the ceremony. It reached into the most important part, the inspection. With hot iron, the hand stayed wrapped, then reopened later as proof. But bandages, ointments, pressure, and cleanliness changed how wounds looked. So did the choice of witnesses allowed close enough to see. The people running the ritual controlled the handling, and the handling shaped the healing. That healing decided guilt or innocence. Timing became a quiet lever. Inspect too soon, and every burn looked damning. Wait longer, and swelling dropped, skin closed, and a story of innocence became easier to sell. In water ordeals, the length of immersion and the way the body entered the water shifted what the crowd read as a sign. The test still carried God's name, but the result often followed human hands. God's judgment became steerable. By the late 1100s, the ordeal no longer looked like a simple act of faith. It looked like a procedure that could be managed. Some churchmen questioned why God would be forced on command, on a court schedule, with the same prayers repeated like a formula. At the same time, rulers and judges wanted tighter control of verdicts, not outcomes that depended on a wound's appearance days later. Law started to shift. More courts leaned on written records, sworn questioning, and decisions that could be reviewed. The ordeal began to seem unreliable, even embarrassing, because it produced results that were hard to explain and easier to dispute. Then the decisive change arrived from the church itself. In the early 1200s, church authorities ended clergy involvement in ordeals, cutting priests out of the rituals that had framed them as divine judgments. That withdrawal changed everything. The ordeal had depended on sacred preparation, blessing, and the priest's authority to declare the test meaningful. Without that, it became just pain with no official bridge to God. Courts still faced the same problem of proving guilt, but they lost the ritual machinery that had made the ordeal feel legitimate. And once the religious engine stopped, the old system could not keep running as before. With the church no longer blessing the rituals, courts lost the tool that had turned pain into a verdict. So officials reached for something else: investigation. Instead of waiting for a wound to heal, they sent people to ask questions, gather rumors, and record statements. The process became more controlled, and it sounded more reasonable. But it also shifted power. Truth no longer came from a miracle. It came from whoever ran the inquiry. In many places, this became inquisitorial procedure. Judges did not just listen, they actively built a case, often in writing, often in secret, sometimes without the accused even knowing every accusation. Written proof mattered more than public ritual, and confession became the fastest path to a conviction. That pressure opened a door to torture in some regions, treated as a way to force certainty when evidence seemed thin. The ordeal ended. Pain stayed, now managed by officials. Elsewhere, the replacement looked different. Some courts leaned toward jury-like fact-finding, pulling local people into deciding what was true based on testimony and reputation, not on a priest's inspection of a burn. It sounded like a safeguard, and sometimes it was. Yet it also carried old biases forward. Neighbours could punish outsiders with a nod, and records could favour those who knew the system. The miracle vanished, but human judgment and human abuse filled the gap. In the end, the divine test faded from the courtroom. Modern courts treated guilt as something that had to be shown, not revealed. They relied on records, witnesses, medical reports, and rules about what counted as proof. They asked whether a claim held up under checking. That shift mattered. It accepted a hard truth the ordeal denied. People could be wrong, and certainty could be dangerous. But the change never erased the old temptation. Early medieval justice had reached for ordeals because evidence felt out of reach and doubt felt like failure. Even centuries later, systems still struggled with the same pressure. To close a case, to name a culprit, to call the story finished. When proof looked thin, officials leaned on shortcuts, confessions, assumptions, common sense. The ritual disappeared, but the appetite for certainty remained. And that appetite still fell unevenly. In theory, evidence-based standards protected everyone. In practice, people with money, status, and trusted connections still gathered better lawyers, better experts, and better narratives. The vulnerable still faced harsher suspicion and fewer second chances. The ordeal ended, yet its legacy persisted in a simple risk. When a society treated truth as absolute, it still tended to burn the powerless first.